Hello, I'm Alan Fulton, Irrigation and Water Resources Advisor. I work in Tehama, Glenn, Colusa, and Shasta counties in the northern Sacramento Valley of California. Welcome to this tutorial on the basic scientific understanding of tree canopy size and its effect on ET rates. In this tutorial, I'll review the basic concepts about tree age, canopy size, and crop ET. I'll suggest some adjustment factors for almond, walnut, and prune that are based on tree age. These are general in nature. Then we'll discuss some approaches to develop site-specific estimates of canopy size and adjustments for ET, which you may prefer. The basic concept of canopy development from transplanting to a mature tree is pretty intuitive. Smaller trees have lower ET rates. The question is how much lower and how does it change as the tree grows? There are many factors that influence how a young orchard develops: the previous crops, the orchard soils, site preparation, and general readiness to plant the orchard. What I mean partly here is whether the irrigation system is installed and functioning. Usually it is, but on occasion, there are instances where it is not. Other factors include sources of seedling trees, the genetics. Are the transplant trees potted? Are they grafted? Their age, have they been in storage, and if so, for how long? Orchard design, the orchard spacing, and your transplant methods will have some bearing on how quickly the orchard fills in its space. The weather before, during, and after transplanting can affect how the orchard takes off. If the soils are heavy in clay and overly wet during planting, this may cause a delay. Another situation is if you're planting later into the spring, early summer, and they are transplanted, followed by extraordinarily high temperatures and hot winds. Your pruning and training methods make a difference. We experience a wide range in pruning techniques now, from heading cuts to no pruning at all. Weed competition, which is sometimes dependent on your irrigation method, will affect how fast the orchard develops. When the trees are very small, and if we use solid set sprinklers, sometimes we can create pretty extensive weed competition for the seedling trees. And of course, your irrigation and nutrition management will be factors as well. There may be other factors that I haven't mentioned here that you can think of. The bottom line is that the actual crop ET and irrigation needs can vary considerably from one orchard to the next. So, are these ET reports that we send out weekly useful for managing young developing orchards? In general, my answer is yes. They can be useful, but you need to be careful, particularly in the first year of planting and in that first month or two after planting. These weekly ET reports are limited during that first month or two after planting. You will likely find that in-field evaluation of the soil moisture and tree conditions is much more useful. Once the trees are rooted and growing well, ET reports may help, but weekly estimates need to be adjusted for changing canopy size. I put in this series of slides to kind of emphasize what you could find yourself up against that first month or two after transplanting. Here you see a row of transplanted trees. They broke bud and they pushed and they started to grow, but then they stalled. And as you look at the tops of these trees, you saw no evidence of new shoot growth, no evidence of the new shoot growth and the young red new leaves, indicating that the tree is getting established and expanding its root system out into the orchard soils. It's during this period where the in-field evaluation of soil moisture, looking at the tree conditions, maybe even carefully digging in the root ball and exploring the health of the roots and seeing if you see new roots and see evidence that they're growing into the orchard soils is probably a better tool at that point than our ET reports. But once the trees get going and you start getting canopy of this nature, then the ET reports have use, but they will need to be adjusted for canopy size. The other thing, just a tip that I would mention, that is in year one and in year two in particular, depending on the soils and the rainfall conditions, you may find that the irrigation requirements are not nearly as high as the ET estimates. And this has to do with the new young trees growing, expanding their root system out, and exploring the soil profile that is refilled with moisture each winter by rainfall. Essentially, they find they can extract and rely on that stored rainfall moisture for a significant part of their in-season needs. So one general approach to adjusting for tree age is to use a tree age adjustment factor. And I'm going to share with you some that we can offer for almond, walnut, and prune. So this table on the left was developed by Farm Advisor Emeritus Blake Sandin in Kern County. And Blake has suggested for a first leaf almond tree that on average, it will use 40% of the ET for the season. He also goes on to show 55% on average for a second leaf, 75% for third leaf, and fourth leaf, 90% of full ET estimates that we report in our tables. Now, when you use these averages, season-long averages, you can probably make some judgment calls and refine them a little bit by realizing, particularly in that first year, that shortly after transplanting, the percentage of ET may be much lower, more on the order of 10, 15%. And then as the tree gets established and grows, it will expand. And so by end of the summer, that fraction of ET may be more towards this 55%. But on average for the year, a 200-day year or longer, about 40% of the ET of a mature tree. For walnut, I evaluated this question in Tehama County. I experienced similar results as Blake Sandin reported for almond in Kern County. On average for the season, first leaf, about 30% ET as reported for a mature orchard. 50% in second leaf, 85% in third leaf, and by fourth leaf, approaching 100% of our estimates of ET for mature trees. This was especially true if we had wet springs and strong vegetation in the middles. I did similar work in prune. Because prune is a shorter statured tree, they take longer to fill in the space, even though we plant them at a higher density to try to compensate. And what I found was year one, average ET was 27% of a mature orchard. Year two, 45%, 65% year three, 70% year four, 80% year five. And by sixth leaf, we were approaching ET of a mature tree that would be fairly stable for the rest of the life of the orchard. So these are some suggested average year age-based adjustments for ET for almond, walnut, and prune. But you may be seeking more precise estimates of ET for your orchard. And so I'd like to suggest to you a methodology that you can apply yourself in your own orchards to make adjustments. This is a method that's been adopted by the Almond Board of California and presented in their Almond Irrigation Improvement Continuum. You can read about it by finding their manual at this link. Essentially, it's based on research from California and other parts of the world, and it seems to apply to most any deciduous orchard crops. And what it's basically showing is a linear relationship between crop ET, the maximum crop ET, the fraction of maximum crop ET, and the fraction of canopy light interception. So on the x-axis is midday light interception, and on the vertical axis is the fraction of ETC of a fully grown or mature bearing orchard. So what it shows is that when we have 20% light interception, we get about 40% of the maximum ET. 30%, not quite 60%. And it's a linear relationship. At 70% canopy light interception, we are approaching what we think are maximum ET levels. And it's fairly well agreed upon that beyond 70% light interception, the crop evapotranspiration rates do not change too much. This is just putting the graphic form presentation into a tabular form. At 20% canopy light interception, roughly 41% or 40% of full ET. At 70%, it progresses fairly steadily up, and at 70% canopy light interception above 100% full ET. So with this information in mind, to apply it, you need to then be able to go out and measure the canopy shading in your orchard. And you can either do this with on-the-ground techniques or using aerial methods. Whichever method you prefer, it's key that you pick a sunny day without clouds, and you do it when the sun's overhead between 12 noon and 2 p.m. Here's an example where I took a digital picture of a prune orchard at noontime with the sun directly overhead and the shadows below the trees. And then by hand, with my computer, I drew in a grid and counted the squares to approximate the percent area of shaded ground or light intercepted. This turned out to be 18 of 44 grids in this case, or about 41% canopy light shading. There are more sophisticated tools available to you, especially if you are an iPhone or iPad user. It's called IPAR. It was developed by our statewide orchard crop specialist, Bruce Lampinen. It can be downloaded, and it essentially does something similar to what I illustrated here by hand, but it's more precise and more sophisticated. So this is a resource you might consider. The alternative to working on the ground is using aerial methods. We can use drones with cameras. We can use fixed wing airplanes that have cameras and flying over our orchards, or we can look to satellite imagery. Here's an example where we applied satellite imagery. Here's a graphic of an almond orchard. The red colors represent areas with smaller trees and less canopy light interception. The yellows, beige, and kind of gray tones represent trees of increasing size and more canopy light interception, and your grays, blues tones represent the largest trees with the greatest light interception. The advantage of an aerial image is that you get the perspective of the entire orchard. It's possible to then do statistics on the individual pixels of data and get a frequency distribution graph of the canopy light interception across the orchard. In this orchard, the majority of the orchard, about 70–80% of it, ranged between 30% and 70% canopy light interception, or what we call PAR, photosynthetic active radiation. On average for the orchard, it was 47%. Okay, this completes this short tutorial on some of the science behind how to determine an adjustment factor for your orchard to adjust the crop ET rates that we report to you in our weekly reports. Thank you.